At 2:14 in the morning, a phone buzzed on a nightstand 60 miles away, and the words on the screen would end up doing something no crime scene photo, no fingerprint, no piece of physical evidence could do on its own. They would name a killer before anyone knew a killer existed. Her name was Renee Callahan. She was 31 years old, worked the closing shift at a mid-sized accounting firm on the edge of a quiet town we'll call Ashford Falls, and by every account, she was the kind of person who texted her sister good morning and good night like clockwork. So when that clockwork broke, when a message came through at an hour Renee never texted, her sister Danielle didn't roll over and go back to sleep. She read it 3 times. And then she sat up in bed with her heart pounding, because something about those 9 words felt very, very wrong. This is the story of how one late-night text message became the thread that unraveled an entire case, how investigators built a homicide investigation around 4 sentences typed in a panic, and how the man Renee feared almost talked his way out of the one piece of evidence he never saw coming. Because here's the promise of this video. By the end, you'll understand exactly how a single text message can carry more legal weight than an eyewitness, how detectives verify a text is real evidence and not just a red herring, and why the person closest to a victim is so often the person a killer is desperate to control. This isn't just a story about a phone, it's a story about how the truth finds a way out, even when someone is doing everything possible to keep it buried. To understand why that 2 a.m. text mattered so much, you have to understand who Renee Callahan was in the weeks before she disappeared, because she was not a woman living an ordinary life. She was a woman quietly bracing for something. 3 months earlier, Renee had ended a relationship with a man named Marcus Doyle. On paper, the breakup looked clean. They'd dated for a little over a year, split amicably according to mutual friends, and Marcus had moved his belongings out of her apartment over a single weekend in March. But amicable is a word people use when they want a situation to sound smaller than it actually is, and co-workers who sat near Renee's desk remembered things differently. They remembered her stepping into the stairwell to take phone calls she didn't want overheard. They remembered her flinching when her phone buzzed on the desk, glancing at the screen before deciding whether to answer. They remembered the day she asked the front desk not to let anyone up without calling her first, and how she wouldn't explain why. Danielle, her older sister, said Renee had started doing something she'd never done before. She began sending Danielle a photo of wherever she was going before she got there. A photo of a restaurant sign before a dinner, a photo of a parking lot before an appointment. It looked, in hindsight, exactly like what it was. It looked like a woman leaving a trail in case she vanished. There's a reason people who study these cases keep coming back to the weeks before, not just the night itself. A single bad night can look like an isolated event. A pattern of small, careful decisions stretched across 90 days looks like something else entirely. A person quietly building a survival plan while trying not to let anyone, including the person she feared, notice she was doing it. There were 3 separate warning signs building in the weeks before Renee disappeared, and it's worth walking through all 3, because none of them alone would have been enough to convince a skeptical detective that something serious was coming. Together they told a very different story. The first sign was a protective order Renee had quietly looked into filing but never completed. Court records later showed she'd requested a consultation with a family law attorney, discussed her options, and then let the paperwork sit unfinished on her kitchen counter for weeks. Friends said she was terrified that filing it would make things worse, not better. That single human hesitation, the fear that asking for help might provoke the exact violence she was afraid of, is one investigators say they see again and again in cases involving controlling former partners. The second sign was financial. Renee had changed banks. She moved a modest savings account to a new institution under her maiden name only, something her sister only discovered after the fact while going through Renee's mail. It wasn't a large sum of money, but it was the kind of quiet, deliberate move someone makes when they're trying to create distance and independence without announcing it to the person they're distancing themselves from. The third sign was the sensory one, the one that's hardest to put into words, but the one Danielle described most vividly. She said that in their last few phone calls, Renee's voice had changed. Not dramatic, not tearful, just quieter, careful, like someone choosing every word the way you'd choose your footing crossing a frozen pond, testing each step before putting your full weight down. Danielle said she noticed it and almost said something, and has spent every day since wishing she had pushed harder. Looking back, none of these three signs would have justified an arrest, a restraining order granted in an afternoon, or even a formal welfare check. That's the frustrating, uncomfortable truth investigators are honest about when they talk to families in similar situations. Fear that hasn't yet turned into a documented threat is legally almost invisible. It lives in gut feelings, in photos sent before dinner, in a quieter voice on the phone. Renee was doing everything a person can reasonably do to protect herself within a system that mostly reacts after something happens rather than before. What she didn't know yet was that the very last thing she would ever type would end up being the one piece of proof strong enough to make the system respond. But here's where it gets interesting, because on the night everything changed, Renee didn't call her sister. She didn't call the police. She typed a text message, sent it, and then her phone went dark for good. The message read, according to court documents later filed in the case, "If something happens to me, it's Marcus. He came by tonight. I'm scared. Love you." 4 sentences, 22 words, sent at 2:14 a.m. from Renee's apartment, according to phone records investigators would later pull. Danielle didn't see the message until 6:40 that morning, when her alarm went off and she reached for her phone out of habit. She said her stomach dropped before she even finished reading it a second time. She called Renee immediately. No answer. She called again. No answer. She texted, then called Renee's workplace, and when a co-worker mentioned Renee hadn't shown up for her morning meeting, something Renee had never in 3 years failed to do, Danielle got in her car and drove 60 miles at a speed she still can't remember clearly. She arrived at Renee's apartment complex a little after 9. The building superintendent let her in after she explained the situation, practically shaking phone screens still open to that text message like it was a life raft. The apartment was empty. Renee's purse was gone. Her car was gone. Her phone, the one that had sent that message 6 hours earlier, was completely dark. No ring, straight to voicemail. Danielle called the police from Renee's kitchen. This is where the second signpost matters, because what happened next teaches something bigger about how modern missing persons cases actually get investigated. In decades past, a missing adult with no obvious sign of a struggle might not trigger urgent action for 24 or even 48 hours. Adults are allowed to leave. Adults are allowed to not answer their phones. But a text message naming a specific person sent hours before someone became unreachable changes the entire calculation for law enforcement. It transforms a missing persons report into something with a defined person of interest attached to it from hour one. Detective Sergeant Paul Amaya, who would eventually lead the case, later described that text as the single most important piece of paper in the entire file, and he meant it literally because his team printed it, laminated it, and pinned it to the center of the caseboard where every other piece of evidence radiated outward from those 22 words. Investigators moved fast. They pulled Renee's cell tower data and confirmed the message had in fact originated from a tower consistent with her apartment location at 2:14 a.m. They confirmed the phone's operating system logs matched a manually typed and sent message, not something auto-generated or spoofed, closing off an early theory that someone else might have staged the text using Renee's unlocked phone. They interviewed neighbors, one of whom recalled hearing raised voices, a man's voice, through a shared wall sometime after 1 in the morning, though she admitted she hadn't thought much of it until police came knocking. And they went looking for Marcus Doyle. He wasn't home, his car wasn't in his driveway, and when officers finally located him 2 days later at a motel 40 miles outside town, registered under his own name, he had a fresh scratch along his forearm and an explanation for it that would not hold up under even the gentlest questioning. Marcus told the first officers who questioned him that he hadn't seen Renee in over a week. He said the scratch on his arm came from yard work. He said he had no idea why she would ever write anything like that text message, calling it, in his words, some kind of misunderstanding that he was sure would clear up once everyone calmed down. But here's where the case turned, and it's the part of the story that matters most if you want to understand how investigators actually build a homicide case around a single piece of digital evidence. A text message naming a suspect isn't a confession. It isn't physical proof of a crime. On its own, a defense attorney can argue it reflects fear, not fact, that a frightened woman named the person she was most afraid of without that person having actually done anything. Prosecutors know this. Good detectives know this too. So the text became not the end of the investigation, but the compass pointing toward everything they needed to corroborate. They pulled Marcus's own phone records and found his phone had in fact pinged off a cell tower near Renee's apartment complex at 1:52 a.m., 22 minutes before her message was sent, directly contradicting his claim that he hadn't seen her in over a week. They obtained security footage from a gas station 4 blocks from Renee's building, showing a vehicle matching Marcus's truck passing through the intersection at 1:47 a.m., and again, heading the opposite direction at 2:31 a.m., 17 minutes after Renee's text went out. The scratch on his forearm, when finally swabbed properly during a second, more thorough interview after investigators secured a warrant, contained DNA that matched Renee under his fingernails, not the other way around, suggesting a struggle rather than the yard work story he'd offered. And then came the detail that closed the loop entirely. When forensic technicians recovered Renee's phone 11 days later, discarded in a drainage culvert nearly 30 miles from her apartment, along the same route that led toward the motel where Marcus was eventually found, the device still contained draft text messages Renee had started and deleted earlier that same night, messages to Danielle that said things like, "I don't feel safe," and "Can you call me?" before she abandoned them, unsent, as if she kept losing her nerve. It was only in that final message, the one she did send, that her fear turned into a name. Danielle later said that reading those unsent drafts was almost harder than reading the one that went through, because it meant her sister had been trying to reach out for hours before she finally found the courage to write down exactly who she was afraid of. Detectives also went back through Marcus's own digital footprint and found a pattern that, once flagged, was hard to unsee. In the days before Renee disappeared, he had searched from his own phone for her new work schedule on a public staff directory, for driving directions to her apartment complex, despite claiming he hadn't been there in over a week, and for an article about how long it typically takes police to treat an adult as officially missing. None of those searches proved intent on their own. Together with everything else, they painted a picture of a man tracking a woman he had already decided he wasn't done with. Marcus Doyle was arrested 3 weeks after Renee's disappearance and charged with her murder. At trial, prosecutors built their case in layers, exactly the way the investigation had unfolded. Cell tower data placing him at the scene, gas station footage placing his vehicle on the route, DNA evidence contradicting his own explanation, and at the center of it all, laminated and entered into evidence just as Sergeant Amaya had pinned it to his caseboard months earlier, the text message itself. 22 words sent at 2:14 in the morning by a woman who had spent weeks quietly preparing for a danger she couldn't fully name out loud until the very end. The jury convicted Marcus Doyle on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison, and here's the moment that recontextualizes everything about this story. The aha moment underneath all of it. Renee Callahan spent 3 months trying every quiet, careful, indirect way she knew to protect herself. The photos before every outing, the bank account under her maiden name, the unfinished protective order sitting on her counter. All of it was preparation for a danger she could see coming but couldn't stop on her own. In the end, it wasn't a lawyer or a locked door that convicted her killer. It was 22 words, typed in fear at 2 in the morning, sent to the one person she trusted most in the world. She named him herself, and in doing that, she made sure that even if he silenced her, he could never truly hide from what he'd done. If this story affected you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more cases where the smallest piece of evidence turned out to be the one that mattered most.